Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 31 October 2024. Today is the 107th anniversary of the birth of William Hardy McNeill, who was born in Vancouver, BC on this date in 1917. McNeill wrote a biography of Toynbee, which I seem to recall somewhere reading was commissioned by Toynbee's heirs, though I can't find this reference anywhere at present. And McNeill was criticized for his book on Toynbee. And why is that? Toynbee, along with Spengler and Hegel, are the bêtes noires of philosophy of history. And it's bad enough for a historian to engage with philosophy of history, but to entertain the philosophy of history of someone like Toynbee verges on the unforgivable. I mentioned in yesterday's episode on Jan Romein that Peter Geil criticized Romein for Toynbee's influence on his work. Even though Toynbee has been enormously influential in philosophy of history, mainstream historians have maintained a nearly complete silence on Toynbee. Hugh Trevor Roper was an exception in his public criticism of Toynbee, most preferring not to acknowledge his work at all, as acknowledgement might be taken to imply some degree of approval, and no historian wanted to be accused of any sympathy for Toynbee. McNeill, however, was willing to take that risk. In his book on Toynbee, he recounts how Toynbee began by being explicit about formulating a philosophy of history, but while engaged in the project, he shifted away from identifying his work as a philosophy of history. Quote, when in the summer of 1930, at age 41, Toynbee first began to busy himself with the monumental task of writing up the notes for a study of history, he was sure in his own mind of the significance of the enterprise, but profoundly uncertain about its reception by others. As we have seen, he gave up referring to his book as a philosophy of history and adopted Rosalind's derogatory nickname, the Nonsense Book, as a sort of camouflage. Toynbee nonetheless maintained an unwavering commitment to his self-appointed task of working out the full scope and implications of his vision of history. His reading convinced him that the record of events in China, India, and even in the tangled Middle East could be structured into a series of tragic civilizational cycles, each conforming to the archetypal career of Hellenism that he had sketched out so elegantly in his Oxford lecture, The Tragedy of Greece in 1920, unquote. Toynbee's 1920 lecture, The Tragedy of Greece, doesn't have anything to say about a civilizational cycle in regard to Greece. And it's surprising that McNeill, who had made an extended study of Toynbee, would have been so careless in this respect. What Toynbee did say was that the whole of Greek history is known to us from beginning to end. And he said that Greek history was a tragedy, though it's not clear to what extent Toynbee was merely using a metaphor of drama to describe the completed course of Greek history. Here's what Toynbee did say in 1920. Quote, in Greek history, the plot of civilization has been worked out to its conclusion. We can sit as spectators through the whole play. We can say this or that is the crisis. From this point onwards, the end is inevitable. Or if this actor has acted otherwise in these circumstances, the issue would not have been the same. We can grasp the structure of the tragedy and divide it into acts, unquote. I'll leave for another time the question of whether a generic periodization, which Toynbee here likens to the acts of a tragedy, corresponds to civilizational cycles. McNeill contributed some basic assumptions of Toynbee's study of history to a collection of essays on Toynbee, in which McNeill gives a measured account of Toynbee's work, offering praise, but not without qualification. Quote, I must confess that I am myself sufficiently close wedded to the zeitgeist of the 20th century to be disturbed by some of Toynbee's mythological and theological language. Yet I find it possible to abstract sound sense from his pages. History, I agree, is change, and change in human society is, I believe, provoked by challenges of whatever sort from outside the closed circle of custom and institutional precedent which binds the normal day-by-day life of men together. And the reality of rhythms and patterns in history I am not disposed to deny. No doubt such crude paraphrase would, for Toynbee himself, lose all the barely expressible overtones and utterly distort the truth he has sought to convey. Such imperfect communication is, however, normal in intellectual discourse and should surprise no one, unquote. Whatever his reservations, McNeill also said that Toynbee presented him with a vision of history that no other author had. Quote, I find much scintillating suggestion and stimulation to thought in Toynbee's pages. He has opened vistas of history and put questions before me as no other single author has done. For this I am grateful. Insofar as he does the like for others of the historical profession, we should all be grateful. He has certainly not spared himself in pursuing a high goal. I hope that future historians may find inspiration in his example and will test, criticize, correct, and not entirely forget to emulate his efforts. If we do, the study of history cannot fail to be enriched, and we will worthily uphold Clio's oft disputed claim to reign a queen among the sciences, unquote. Possibly inspired by Toynbee, McNeill went on to offer a grand scope of history in his own works. Perhaps his most famous book was Plagues and Peoples, which opens a vista of history onto infectious diseases, which might seem an unlikely topic for a grand history, but in McNeill's hand, he makes it work. We can reasonably ask whether McNeill's Plagues and Peoples is a specialist history or a grand narrative. And this may sound contradictory that we could even find these two properties in one work, but hear me out. Plagues and Peoples is a specialist history insofar as it focuses on the role of infectious diseases in human history. On the other hand, in its 6 chapters, McNeill spans the entirety of human history from the first chapter, Man the Hunter, which covers prehistory, to the last chapter, the ecological impact of medical science and organization since 1700, which brings the book up to the present time. In this sense, in the sense of covering the whole of human history guided by a central idea, McNeill's Plagues and Peoples is a grand narrative. I would characterize McNeill's work in terms of a thoroughgoing naturalism. And when an historian takes naturalism seriously, aspects of history that are peripheral in traditional accounts, like disease, for example, take on central importance in McNeill's account. Taking this unusual perspective on history entails unusual judgments. In the introduction, McNeill makes a distinction among macroparasites and microparasites. Microparasites are the familiar bacteria and viruses that live off human beings. Macroparasites are other large organisms like human beings, and which in some cases are human beings, that live off human beings. McNeill characterizes early human societies as being essentially macroparasitic, with elite classes living off the labor of others, with later developments masking this parasitic relationship, which is nevertheless maintained under the surface, as it were. In this way, McNeill makes civilization itself and the relationship of macroparasites to their hosts. It's not a pretty picture, and it's an unflattering way to look at civilization, but this is what makes the book so interesting. We could think of Plagues and Peoples as a necessary preface to later works of naturalistic history, among which I would include the works of Jared Diamond, who's very well known today. McNeill was critical of Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and wrote of it in a review, quote, "A better title would be History Upside Down, a biological view of the human past. But the author, a researcher in evolutionary biology and biogeography specializing in birds, would surely object to such a description of his book, arguing instead that it is historians who err by approaching their subject downside up, thanks to their myopic concentration on literate societies in the last 5,000 years of history," unquote. Despite the criticism, there's an important sense in which McNeill made Diamond's book possible by his earlier Plagues and Peoples. Diamond integrated McNeill's diseased-focused view of history into a more comprehensive narrative that also prominently features technology, and especially the technology of warfare. Diamond has been accused of geographical determinism, and McNeill wants to distance himself from this. Geographical determinism is, you could say, looked down upon almost as much as Toynbee. But we could plausibly find geographical determinism in Plagues and Peoples if we look for it there, as many have looked for it in the pages of Guns, Germs, and Steel and found it there. In my episode on Montesquieu, I mentioned that Montesquieu was considered an early representative of geographical determinism, so that we can produce a lineage of this tradition, which I would prefer to think of as naturalistic history. We could place McNeill's Plagues and Peoples in an even larger context and in this tradition of naturalistic history if we locate it midway between Hans Zinsser's Rats, Lice, and History on the one hand and Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel on the other. This is the lineage of big picture naturalistic history, starting with Montesquieu or earlier, and also including Ellsworth Huntington's Civilization and Climate, as well as a number of contemporary historians, with later practitioners doing naturalistic history on a grand scale. In my episode on Herbert Bolton, I argued that once one begins the expansion of the scope of history, that this naturally tends to take in the whole of human history diachronically and the whole of our planet synchronically. The scope of human action today has become the Earth entire, so there's a natural teleology in the development of historical thought to converge on planetary scale history, or as it was called earlier, world history. McNeill wasn't the only one doing world history in his time, but he was a key figure in world history in the second half of the 20th century. In his 1985 AHA address, Why Study History?, McNeill distinguishes among what he calls three levels of history: personal local history, national history, and global history. On global history, he offers three desiderata. 1. The subject of history does not lead to exact prediction of future events. Though it fosters practical wisdom, knowledge of the past does not permit anyone to know exactly what is going to happen. 2. We can only know ourselves by knowing how we resemble and how we differ from others. Acquaintance with the human past is the only way to such self-knowledge. And 3, for those especially attracted to it, search into odd corners and contemplation of the main outlines of history can develop into a hunt for understandings of one's own, as new ideas about connections between one thing and another spring to mind. And McNeill concludes his American Historical Association lecture with this, quote, "Eternal and unchanging truth does not emerge. Only inspired, informed guesses about what mattered and how things changed through time. That is all human minds can do to unravel the mystery of humanity and of human groups' encounters with one another and with the world. Not very good, perhaps, simply the best we have in the unending effort to understand ourselves and others and what happens and will happen to us and to them time without end." Unquote. This is a rather modest conclusion for all the effort that has been put into history. I think we can say a great deal more about the past than informed guesses about what mattered and how things changed through time. I think Toynbee would have agreed with me on this, but for all of McNeill's engagement with Toynbee's work, he was not willing to go as far as Toynbee in the analysis of history. Even if we hold Toynbee to be wrong, or at very least incomplete, we can clearly see he was aiming at something more ambitious than the vision with which McNeill concluded his AHA talk. World history seems to me now as a transitional phase in historical thought. And I emphasize now because I was quite enamored of world history when I was a child. It was you could say, the most comprehensive thing I had encountered up until that point of time before I had encountered anything like philosophy of history. Historical thought today is slowly and surely liberating itself from its parochial roots and converging on something more universal and comprehensive. I hesitate to call the history yet to come universal history because this idea, that is to say, the idea of universal history, has its own history and its own conventions. I could identify the history yet to come as big history, as I have referred to big history several times in these episodes, but I think even big history is a way station on the way to something greater. And the parochial roots of history still have their place, so don't get me wrong on that score. What Nietzsche called antiquarian history will always play an important role, not only in historical thought, but perhaps more importantly, in the pious effort of preserving local traditions that would otherwise be lost. What I hope for history is that humanity eventually has a future that's so grand that we will eventually account world history as a thing parochial to Earth. And in this way, world history or planetary history will be parochial history and will continue to have an ongoing place in the more comprehensive history of which it represents the lower limit. Happy birthday, William McNeill, and happy Halloween. Let me know if I missed anything or what I've gotten wrong in the comments, and thanks for listening.